for actually taking her busy schedule to actually do a briefing, particularly for Empower and all the NGOs. So you have collected all your questions. So Sanya is actually an expert, serious expert on the TPPA, and she has been working on this issue for a long time. So she has come all the way from Geneva to actually share her experience with her. So make use of her. Yeah, and I think that, you know, Gudia is here, you know, we can have a good discussion. So anytime when you are ready.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming out on a rainy night to learn about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So I'm sorry I don't have useful slides, but at least this way is more interactive. You told me what you'd like to cover, so we can work that way. So of course, this is supposed to be a free trade agreement between 12 countries. So in addition to Malaysia, there is Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore from ASEAN, US, Canada, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So the main one you need to remember is the US, because when the US negotiates free trade agreements, they have a template. They have their 29 chapters and they bring it to you and they say, oh, you can make a few changes in the margins and that's it. Basically, you swallow it whole. And we can see this when you look at the past US free trade agreements. They're all very similar. But there are a couple of new tricks in the TPP that make it worse for Malaysia. Fresh new tricks. So, and for those of you who remember what was happening here in 2007, 2008, when Prime Minister Abdullah Badawi was the Prime Minister, Malaysia was negotiating a bilateral US free trade agreement. So that was basically the same thing minus the new tricks, but just two countries. And at that time, Malaysia had a lot of negotiation rounds, but in the end didn't sign, because the cabinet had, I think, 58 red lines of things they said were bad for Malaysia and for the national interest, and the US was inflexible and they insisted on it, so tidak jadi. There was no agreement, not signed. What happened after that? Did America bomb Malaysia? No lah. Malaysia kept exporting as it has been until today. It kept getting foreign direct investment a certain amount. So if we don't sign TPP, what happens? We continue as today. And so what does that mean? Well, the TPP is 6,000 pages long, approximately, 30 chapters. Of those 30 chapters, 6 are about what you would think of as a free trade agreement. You think a free trade agreement is about exporting laptops made in Penang to America with 0 tariffs, right? Exporting baju made in America. Yes, that is in the TPP. But the other 24 out of the 30 chapters are about Malaysia's laws and regulations, Malaysia's environment laws, labour laws, intellectual property laws that affect medicine prices and textbooks, the ability of state and local governments to regulate. So only 6 out of the 30 chapters are about trade. And in those 6 chapters, the general rule is that the TPP countries remove the tariffs, the taxes on each other's exports, right? So you would think that everybody removes them over the same period, we gradually go down. But when I had a quick look, Malaysia has a maximum of 16 years, 16 tahun, to remove its tariffs. Guess how long the US has? They're more developed, right? In the World Trade Organization, the developed are supposed to liberalize more quickly. It's supposed to be special and differential treatment exceptions for developing. But in the TPP, the US has given themselves 30 years before they remove their most sensitive tariffs. Malaysia got 16. So this is special and differential treatment for the US. Now what happens, does anybody care about farmers, agriculture? Yes, sir. Okay, farmers. So what happens to the Malaysian farmers if Malaysia removes all the tariffs on US farm products? You might know that the US subsidizes a lot. They give their farmers a lot of subsidies. And those subsidies can mean that, for example, the cost of rice production in the US is high, right, compared to Malaysia. Then you give such a big subsidy to the US rice farmer that his rice is cheaper than Malaysia. But Malaysia today is allowed to have a 40% tariff on American rice, so we go back up to here. But under the TPP, it looks like that goes down to 0 tariffs. And because of the subsidies, the US rice can be cheaper than the Malaysian rice. So then the Malaysian rice farmers would be wiped out. So what does that mean for rice self-sufficiency in Malaysia? Malaysia has a rice self-sufficiency policy. I think it was 80%, now it's 60%. Because if you remember in the last food crisis, the Philippines doesn't grow enough rice. They tried to import it. They could not import it for love or money. Because although a lot of rice is grown in the world by India and China, they eat most of it. So very little is traded. So if you can't be self-sufficient, sometimes it's very hard to buy the rice you need. If you don't have rice, then very difficult in an Asian country. So in the TPP, what happens to the US farm subsidies? Well, their export subsidies are removed. But that is nothing new. America has not been using export subsidies for years, and they are removed by the World Trade Organization for all 160 countries, including all the TPP countries, last December. What the US does is subsidize domestic subsidies. So this is where the US government pays the farmer like an income of, say, $50,000 a year, whether he grows rice or not. Then if he grows rice, he can export it very cheap because he already has his livelihood. So he can export it below the cost of production. So although it's a domestic subsidy, it keeps his exports cheap. So then the rice comes to Malaysia very cheap. Now those domestic subsidies not touched in the TPP. US can continue, can even increase. But Malaysia, we've got money to give domestic subsidies to rice farmers as much as the US. If you are an arms race of subsidizing, the US has deeper pockets. So the farmers can be affected by subsidized imports coming in. Now, of course, Malaysia and US grow different things, right? US doesn't grow bananas and mangoes and kangkong, but there are some products the same. Rice, chicken, the main subsidy for chicken is the grain, that's the main cost. So, for example, EU chicken dumped in Africa has wiped out the African chicken farmers. But also maybe pork, depending on Malaysia's pork farmers. So where there is competition. So, but the goods chapter also affects Malaysian SMEs, say, if you are in the manufacturing sector. And if you are making products where currently you have tariffs from the US and then you go to zero, then they face competition. And if in future they want to move into new industries, usually you have what we call infant industry protection. So as you move into a new sector like building airplanes, you give them a bit of tariff protection. This is what every country except Hong Kong did to industrialize. Once you have economies of scale and marketing channels, you remove the tariffs, then you can compete. But Malaysia now will be locked at zero tariffs on all the products from America, which has the whole production chain. So no more moving up the value chain into new sectors because you'll immediately face competition. So this is the goods chapter. But what else is in the goods chapter is Malaysia's export tariffs. This is for those who are asking about colonization. So Malaysia today has export taxes on raw materials like wood or palm oil, crude palm oil. And what that does is it keeps the price of wood in Malaysia cheap because there's an export tax. So it's used for the furniture industry, and the furniture that is made in Malaysia is cheaper than the world price because the wood was cheaper because there was an export tax on the wood. So the Malaysian furniture industry employs tens of thousands of people. They need that export tax on the wood to be sustainable. The same for crude palm oil. Malaysia and Indonesia both grow palm oil. If Indonesia raises the export tax and Malaysia doesn't, the palm oil runs to Indonesia and is processed there because both countries have too much refining capacity. So Malaysia needs to have an export tax to support the jobs and the value-added processing in palm oil refining, making it into soap and into biscuits and into chemicals and into biofuels, biodiesel. And the same for even the steel industry. The steel industry in Malaysia is run on scrap metal because you have two ways. If you're a big country, a lot of population, you go from iron ore, from dug up from the ground. But a country the size of Malaysia, you melt down the scrap metal, that's why they steal the manhole covers, and melt it down and turn it into boilers and video cameras. So there's not enough scrap metal in the world. Everybody wants it. Everybody's stealing manhole covers. So Malaysia puts an export tax on scrap metal to make sure the steel industry has raw materials. The developed countries don't like export taxes in developing countries because the developed countries don't have raw materials anymore. They cut down their forests, they took all their minerals, they want them to come cheap from the developing countries. Then they make them into furniture in America and sell it back to Malaysia. They want the value-added jobs in their own countries. So the US and the European Union try to remove export taxes. The TPP doesn't remove Malaysia's export taxes, but it only can use them for the products listed to the amount listed. So in future, if Indonesia raises their export tax on crude palm oil, Malaysia cannot. So the palm oil will run to Indonesia and the value-added jobs will be in Indonesia. Because Indonesia is not in the TPP, at least not yet. So Malaysia is stuck, can only use export taxes on what it has listed to the amounts listed. So when your question about is it economic colonization, it may be that in the days of colonies, the job of the developing countries was to send the raw materials to Britain and America, and they would process it and send the finished furniture back. So it looks like that's what it pushes back towards. So this goods chapter was supposed to be where Malaysia gains. Generally, developing countries are cheaper at making clothes than the US, cheaper at making shoes, cheaper at making computers. These were supposed to be the chapters where Malaysia would benefit, to offset the 24 chapters that are costs out of the 30 chapters. But in these chapters alone, even the PricewaterhouseCoopers study, which MITI commissioned and was released a month ago or something, admits that if Malaysia joins the TPP, Malaysia's trade balance, how much it imports, how much it exports, will get worse by $12 billion a year. This is not surprising because today Malaysia's tariffs are like this high, let's say 22%, US tariffs 3%. Everybody goes to zero. Who is sacrificing more? Malaysia. So Malaysia's imports would increase by more than the US imports would increase. And Malaysia's exports cannot increase by much because the US tariff is already 3%. 3% to zero, not much difference. And to get the zero, you have to comply with the rules of origin to prove this is made in Malaysia. It goes back up to 5. the average tariff. So unsurprisingly, even the PricewaterhouseCoopers study found if Malaysia joins the TPP, Malaysia's trade balance will worsen by $12 billion a year, because the imports into Malaysia will increase by more than Malaysia's exports. If Malaysia does not join the TPP, its trade balance will go up. It will do better. So this was the PricewaterhouseCoopers finding. Now, it's not very pretty, right? It doesn't look very pro-TPP. So then they dressed it up a bit, and they said, don't worry about the trade balance. GDP will go up. But when you look at the methodology that they used to get this gross domestic product going up, economic growth, they admit that 90% of the increase in gross domestic product is from their assumptions that something called non-tariff measures will be cut by 50%. They don't explain what is non-tariff measures except to say it includes subsidies. Now remember, subsidies are not cut in the TPP. Sure, export subsidies are gone, but the US wasn't using. Domestic subsidies are still there and can increase. But PwC says, let us assume that subsidies are cut by 50%, then GDP growth is how many 100 billion. So they make up an imaginary text, and they say, in my imaginary text, GDP will go up. But what we have is 6,000 pages of actual text that the MITI Minister Tokpa will sign on the 4th of February this year, next month, after the Parliament debates it on the 26th, 27th, 28th. The Malaysian Parliament will debate and then probably have a whipped vote and pass it. Of course, it doesn't have to pass the Malaysian Parliament, they're just doing it for debate purposes. So the GDP growth in the PricewaterhouseCoopers study is based on assumptions that have no bearing on the actual reality of the text. Even though it was released after the text was released, and they said we adjusted the key findings in accordance with the text, it's not based on the text. Then they said, don't worry, a lot of investment will come. But that investment is made on even more dodgy assumptions according to the economists. So it still looks like in the chapter where Malaysia is supposed to benefit to offset the costs, it's a net loss, $12 billion a year, trade deficit, or the trade surplus gets less, gets worse. What about the other chapters? There is a chapter, this is going back to the impact on your local businesses, but also on your ability to regulate. I don't know how many of you like Linus, is worried about Linus, worried about fracking, this kind of dodgy activities. Okay, so this is where the services and investment chapters are relevant. Services you can think of as everything you cannot drop on your foot, from professional services like lawyers, doctors, dentists, to electricity, phones, banking, insurance, mamak shops, petrol stations, hypermarkets. These are all services. And the general rule in the TPP is you must liberalize. Liberalize doesn't mean remove tariffs for services. It means you open to foreign investors. So it means you open to investors in all the sectors, to investors from other TPP countries, Singapore, Vietnam, America, unless you have an exception. So if you don't want fracking, you have to put fracking as an exception. If you don't want casinos, you have to put casinos as an exception. If you don't want vaping shops, you have to put vaping shops as an exception. And the thing about the services and investment chapter is it's strictly binding on all levels of government. Federal government, negeri, the state government, and the local tempatan government. So if Petaling Jaya wants to ban along-along or casinos, they've got to have an exception. Now the local government's got an automatic exception for what they do today anyway, but not for future things they want to do that are bad for the investor. The federal and state governments had to list down their exceptions. If they didn't list, too bad. You have to allow as much of that activity, toxic waste dumps, nuclear power plants, whatever, unless you got an exception. And those exceptions, it's not just everything Malaysia wants. You have to negotiate. All the other 11 country governments have to agree. The US has to agree to allow you to ban casinos or nuclear power plants. So you can see the text of the TPP was released in November last year, and you can see it on the website, the 6,000 pages, and you can see where Malaysia got exceptions. And Malaysia didn't seem to get as many exceptions as other countries. So you need to look to see if your area of concern there is an exception or not. So that's the general rule about services. And if you think, alamak, I opened to vaping shops and now I want to ban them, and so since I can't ban them, let me charge them a licensing fee of $1 million a year so that they don't want to come. That is also illegal. They found that loophole and they closed it. You can't charge them a high licensing fee to discourage them. So then we come to the famous investment chapter, or infamous. This is where the ISDS, investor-to-state dispute settlement, is. So the investment chapter is about protecting the rights of foreign investors in Malaysia. It's a bill of rights for the investors, not human rights, investors' rights. So what gets protected by this chapter? And this chapter, again, is strictly binding on all levels of government. The PJ government must comply. and all the Negeri governments and the federal government. So, what is protected in this investment chapter? The things you would think, like a factory, foreign direct investment, but also their patents, their copyrights, their shares, stocks, bonds, futures, options, licenses, permits, contracts, future profits, expected profits. These are all protected investments by the chapter. So the rights of the investor are things like to be treated fairly and equitably. We all thought, what is the problem, right? We must treat everybody fairly and equitably. But recently, this has become widely interpreted by the International Tribunal who will decide the case. And one of the ways it can be interpreted is that the government cannot change the laws and regulations or have new laws and regulations in a way that harms the foreign investor from the other TPP country. Because when Philip Morris, the tobacco company, came to Malaysia 45 years ago, he expects constant laws and regulations until he leaves Malaysia in 99 years' time. Never mind that along the way you found smoking kills people and you want to ban tobacco advertising and you want to have health warning labels and you want to have a tobacco tax. Too bad. It's unfair to the foreign investor. He must have a constant regulatory environment, otherwise unfair to him. So if that is the case, then Parliament closed shop law. What's the point? Parliament's job is to make laws, change laws, amend laws, and often in response to new circumstances. I don't know if you remember the plastic in baby bottles, the BPA baby bottles, right? We banned the BPA in baby bottles. 10 years ago, we didn't know. We found out